Okay.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Words Writers. I see that many of you are checking in already. It's good to see the number interested in this topic. Yeah, hang with us for a few more minutes and we'll begin the program officially. But thank you, audience, for joining us. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming in. A couple more minutes and we'll be starting the program.
Thank you, everybody. Before we officially start the program, I guess we are officially starting the program. Hi, everybody. My name is Elizabeth Rudrud, and I'm the Executive Director of the Southwest Seattle Historical Society. And always, it's our pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program. Words Writers Southwest Stories is a free monthly speaker series that highlights local authors, historians, and voices to foster a deeper understanding of our community and its people. The program is generously supported by Humanities Washington and from sustained support from For Culture and the Office of Arts and Culture. And their generosity, as well as our participant donations, make these free experiences possible tonight. And if you'd like to learn more about the Southwest Seattle Historical Society or get updates on our upcoming programs, you can always visit us at loghousemuseum.org. We will leave time tonight for your questions at the end of the program, so feel free to add your questions to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any time during your presentation, and we'll get to as many as we can. And we thank Rebecca, our presenter, for her time tonight, and we want to acknowledge that Indigenous people are the first authority on the subject of Indigenous art. As many of you know, the Southwest Seattle Historical Society exhibits a totem pole at our museum that towered over the city since the 1960s. It was a recreation of one carved by Indigenous artists that had stood in that same spot since the 1930s. In 2006, that pole was replaced by a story pole carved by Duwamish artist Michael Halliday, who very wonderfully shared his process as a speaker with us at our gala last year. And then that pole was donated to our museum by the city. Indigenous people and artists have been creating art in this region for thousands of years, and we as an organization commit to continuing to work with Indigenous communities on helping to update our interpretation for our pole, which contains layers of complicated histories, including the history of colonization, appropriation, and misrepresentation. And with that, I am going to pass this along to the chair of our Words Writers program, Dora Faye Henricks, and she will introduce our speaker tonight.
Hello again, everyone, and thank you. Heard some of this information or seen it before, but historically, the large, beautiful sculptures we call totem poles were carved by first peoples living far to the north of Puget Sound. But tonight we'll hear from our presenter, Rebecca Albiani, how the totem pole became a symbol of Seattle and who carved the pole currently residing at the Log House Museum. And you just heard a hint of that. We'll hear the crazy, tragic, and moving stories behind some of Seattle's oldest and newest native poles. Rebecca studied Italian and art history at UC Berkeley, graduating with highest honors, and earned a master's in art history at Stanford, where she focused on 16th century Venetian painting. While a graduate student, she received a Fulbright Scholarship for research in Venice. She moved to Seattle in 1996 and for over 20 years has been a popular art history lecturer at the Frye Art Museum, where her topics have ranged from ancient Egypt to contemporary art. She tours widely in the Puget Sound area and particularly enjoys introducing audiences to unfamiliar artists. Thank you for being here with us, Rebecca. We're anxious to hear more of this story. You're on
Thank
next.
you. Thank you. Let me share my screen. There. When I first visited Seattle as a child in the 1970s, my parents took us to see the Pioneer Square totem pole. So I am not a native Seattleite, and I am certainly not a member of any of the indigenous tribes of this region. But I am an art historian who has long studied representations of power. And as such, the use of the totem pole as a representation of Seattle intrigues me. So we saw this totem pole, and we also saw the totem pole in Seattle Center when we visited the Space Needle. We had learned that Seattle was named for a great Indian chief. So we probably believed that these totem poles were the products of Chief Sayalt's culture. We were wrong, but it was an easy mistake to make. After all, the Seattle hockey team was called the Seattle Totems, and there were totem poles decorating grocery stores and bowling alleys and Northgate Mall. They were ubiquitous. In fact, there was a voracious appetite for totem poles all over the United States that began around the turn of the 20th century as more Americans toured Southeast Alaska and Northwestern Canada, the areas where these were made, and began bringing back poles. The St. Louis World's Fair of 1904 featured several totem poles adorning the Alaska building, correctly identifying their provenance. But as the popularity of totem poles grew, they began to be associated with Native Americans in general. In fact, totem is an Ojibwe word. It means for the Ojibwe, a clan or family emblem, often an animal, but has nothing to do with the Pacific Northwest culture that originated these magnificent carvings. So by the middle of the 20th century, you began to get complete absurdities like this. This was the set of a Western film, Take a Hard Ride from 1975. Now it is a Western theme park in the Canary Islands, but the designers felt it was legitimate to combine teepees and totem poles from utterly different cultural backgrounds. Now, the tribes of the Pacific Northwest coast do extend down into Washington and Oregon with somewhat related languages and cultures, stories, etc. And all of these tribes were master carvers. But they did not all carve poles. Only the far northernmost of these people historically carved totem poles, principally the Tlingit, Tsimshian, and Haida, although the poles eventually began to work farther south. These are the cultures, the tribes that have a word for totem pole in their language. And none of these is even in Washington state. The heyday of pole carving was in the mid 19th century, and it coincided with contact with European settlers. Steel tools could carve a pole much more efficiently than earlier stone tools. The fur trade created great wealth for certain tribes, and pole carving, often linked to the potlatch ceremony, was one way of displaying that wealth. Tremendous numbers of poles were raised in communities like Yan on Haida Gwaii, which Emily Carr called the Queen Charlotte Islands. By Emily Carr's day, however, the totem boom had become a bust. The tribes, by the end of the 19th century, were decimated by smallpox and other Western diseases. The potlatch ceremony that often inspired pole carving was criminalized first by Canada and then by the United States in the 1880s. By Carr's day, many of the villages that had once dotted Haida Gwaii had been abandoned, and the poles were being left to rot, which is absolutely what they were intended to do. They came from the earth and should return to the earth, as they are allowed to do in Gwaii Hanan National Park Preserve. Our friends in Japan understand this. In 1961, the city of Seattle shipped a 35-foot high totem pole crowned with a Thunderbird figure to our new sister city, Kobe, Japan. But a few years ago, it was found to be no longer structurally sound. So the mayor of Kobe consulted with tribes both here in Seattle and far to the north of here, traditional totem carving tribes, to understand how to respectfully retire a pole. And so they laid it down in the Municipal Arboretum in a section where Pacific Northwest coast plants are planted. It's called the Seattle Forest. And so this is where this pole is spending the rest of its life. And it was replaced by a new one carved by a member of the Puyallup tribe. But by 1961, Seattle was so strongly identified with totem poles for that to be our gift to Kobe. And I'm asking why carving was criminalized. The potlatch was criminalized. The potlatch, which was the gift-giving ceremony of the great chiefs of the Pacific Northwest coast. And this was done, it was criminalized because the United States and Canada were repressing Native cultures. They believed that the Indians should adopt Western culture, including Christianity. So this was a period of boarding schools, of outlawing Native languages, Native dress, and Native ceremonies, including the potlatch. So by 1961, again, we are sending totem poles as gifts to our sister city. And the identification of Seattle with the totem pole all started in 1899, when this pole was erected with great fanfare in Pioneer Square. That August, 1899, the Post-Intelligencer had sponsored a booster cruise of local Seattle businessmen to promote the idea of Seattle as gateway to Alaska. And when that cruise reached Fort Tongass, Alaska, it appeared to be largely deserted. And I will let third mate R.D. McGilvery tell the tale. He said, quote, "The Indians were all away fishing. except for one who stayed in his house and looked scared to death. We picked out the best-looking totem pole. I took a couple of sailors ashore and we chopped it down, just like you'd chop down a tree. It was too big to roll down the beach, so we sawed it in two, end quote. So they appropriated this pole. They stole it from this native village, and a couple of months later, unveiled it in Pioneer Square, greeted by cheers of a multitude of people. Now, there were those who were against the erection of the pole, but not because it was stolen or inauthentic to Seattle, but rather because they found it barbarian and ungodly. However, it was also argued that it was magnificent and unique. No other great American city had a totem pole. So here it stands. And within a month of its erection, the Tlinkets, who had by that time returned to Fort Tongass and found their monument missing, sued the city of Seattle for $20,000. The case was thrown out of court, although the PI did pay $500 in restitution to the heirs of the woman whose grave marker this was. This was a memorial pole for a Tlingit elder named Chief of All Women. Now, Wikipedia says this pole dates to 1790, which would make it an exceptionally early surviving pole, but that is incorrect. Within a couple of years, Seattle archaeologists had interviewed the Kinnanook family members of Chief of All Women. She was of the Raven clan and had drowned in the Noss River while traveling to visit an ailing sister. But within a few years, this pole had become a symbol of Seattle. And in 1909, Seattle hosted the Alaska Yukon Pacific Expo that extolled Seattle's position as gateway to Alaska and the Orient. They even put up a traditional torii gate, a Japanese-style gateway with totem pole uprights. And they used the image of the Pioneer Square totem pole on the publicity, the souvenirs, and so forth. You see it here on the handle of a silver spoon. Now, a lot of the use of the totem pole had to do with one of the fair's biggest supporters, J.E. Stanley, owner of Ye Old Curiosity Shop. Already in 1901, Stanley had hired Sam Williams to carve totem poles to sell in his shop. Williams was from southern Vancouver Island, from the Ditadot tribe, a tribe that did not have a tradition of carving monumental poles. But those totem poles helped make Ye Old Curiosity Shop a tourist attraction, and there are still to this day descendants of Sam Williams carving poles for the shop. So in 1909, the year of that World's Fair, the Alaska Yukon Fair, the Ye Old Curiosity Shop issued a pamphlet that they called The History of Totem Poles, in which they wrote, quote, "Totemism embraces forms of deity, demon, myths, charms, evil spirits, legend, and witchcraft. These totemism symbols are regarded with superstitious, almost sacred reverence," end quote. None of that is true. Was Stanley grossly misinformed? No, he was a businessman. He knew what would sell totem poles, and that kind of lurid rhetoric was exactly what got people excited about buying his goods. Now, that original 1870 pole survived until 1938. It was already suffering from rot, and at that point, it was targeted by arsonists. But it was a fortuitous time to lose a totem pole because in the late 1930s, the WPA, Roosevelt's Works Progress Administration in Alaska, had formed the Saxman Workshop, hiring native carvers to copy deteriorating historic totem poles. So the surviving pieces of our pole, were sent back to Alaska, where Tlingit craftsmen carved a reproduction. Charles Brown was the lead carver. Several of the carvers were descendants of the Kinnanook family of Fort Tongass, the descendants of Mother of All Women. The new pole arrived via ship in 1940 and was rededicated. So, just briefly, this pole contains at least 3 different myths. At the very top is Raven with a crescent beak, or crescent moon in his beak, from the story of Raven stealing the light. Below Raven is a woman holding her frog child and a downward facing frog who was her husband. This woman is from a tale of a woman who hated frogs and married a man who, unbeknownst to her, was a shape-shifting frog, and they had frog children. The story ends tragically for the frog population. Below that, but that woman, the frog-hating woman, was one of Mother of All Woman's ancestors, and so she had the right to display this story on her memorial pole. Then there is a story, the figures of mink and raven and blackfish, orca. So there's mink and raven, and this is orca. There's orca's fin. Orca's blowhole is this beautifully carved human face, and that's from a story in which Raven and Mink lived for a while inside of Orca, eating the things that Orca ate and eating Orca from the inside. And then the bottom figure, the lowest figure, is Grandfather Raven, recognizable by his long curved beak, who is also part of the very top story, the story of Raven stealing the daylight. So you'll sometimes see that you read a totem pole from top to bottom or from bottom to top, but often there is no order necessarily, but these are all crests that are associated with the person who erected the pole, with the family of the Raven clan, the Kinnanook family, who were honoring their elder Mother of All Women. Now, you don't have to go far in Pioneer Square to find another totem pole. In Occidental Park, there is this one of Sun and Raven. Just checking the Q&A. I think I answered already. So Sun and Raven, this is the story of Raven stealing the light. This is a story of the sun, which was jealously guarded by an old chief in a clan house. Sometimes he would take it out of its bent wood box to admire it, but the rest of the world remained in darkness. But he had a beautiful daughter. And Raven's only way to gain entry into that clan house was to turn himself into a spruce or hemlock needle and be swallowed by the daughter, thereby impregnating her. She gives birth to Raven, a very precocious infant who clamors to be allowed to play with the boxes of the stars and the sun and the moon. And after releasing the moon and the stars, Raven will take the sun in his beak and fly away with it. So this is one of the most famous Pacific Northwest coast myths. But this is not carved by a native carver. Duane Pascoe was an artist of European origin, but it was also Duane Pascoe who carved the Seattle Center totem that I showed you. And it was Pascoe that the Seattle Bergen Sister City Association turned to when they wished to give a totem pole to Seattle's sister city, Bergen, in Norway. One of Duane Pascoe's major influences was the carver Bill Holm, who was also not native, but was one of the most important teachers of native carving in mid-century Seattle. Holm created these two poles that stand out in front of the Burke Museum. The one on the left is the replica of a Tsimshian memorial pole from a village where the poles had been documented photographically and then later destroyed by Christian missionaries. So Bill Holm recreated this pole from photographic evidence. And the one on the right was a Haida pole. And I think you can see the difference in their design. Bill Holm was the most influential writer and scholar on Northwest Coast native design, on the form line style, on the differences between the various major tribes' artistic expressions. He was mentored by and befriended by Mungo Martin, who is a key figure in the revival of monumental carving among Pacific Northwest Coast First Peoples in the 20th century. Mungo Martin was hired by the University of British Columbia to carve replicas of their collection of aging poles. So although he was Kwakwaka'wakw, he would copy Haida poles in Haida style, Tlingit poles in Tlingit style. So he learned a variety of styles and also taught them. He was the stepson of Charlie James, who had kept alive the carving tradition through the era of repression of the potlatch, of outlawing of native expression, largely by making models and other small-scale objects for the tourist trade. But there's a difference between making a 14-inch high object and felling a tree and hollowing it and carving a monumental pole. Mungo Martin would teach those skills to the next generation of native carvers, including his own son and his niece, Ellen Neal, probably the first professional woman native carver. His descendants are still carving. But he also taught non-native carvers. And Bill Holm earned his respect by learning Kwakwaka'wakw, the native language, and by learning, assimilating the different styles. So here Holm is carving a Shimeon pole. It's a deep style of carving, and each figure is distinct from the next. His Haida pole is more shallowly carved, but the figures intertwine with one another. So this figure is holding the hat and has its knees around the hat of the figure below him. And that figure grasps the dorsal fin of the downward facing whale below it. So this is characteristically Haida carving. Holm taught many carvers, some of them native. One of them, Marvin Oliver, who said, quote, "I told myself no white guy was going to teach me about native art until I met him. It was his undying sensitivity to Northwest Coast art and his respectful approach. I wanted to teach Northwest native art like him because there were way too few people doing it," end quote. So Marvin Oliver went on to be a very influential teacher of Pacific Northwest Coast art and carving. And Oliver's two totems used to grace Victor Steinbruch Park at the north end of Pike Place Market. This one is done in a more Haida style. And this is Marvin Oliver at the time it was erected, giving an interview about it. But this one is of a style that is similar to some that we saw in that 1890s photograph of Fort Tongass, where the pole is mostly plain with figures only on the top. In this case, figures of farmers, honoring the farmers of Pike Place Market. Now, not long ago, a controversy erupted over whether these works were native enough. Their main carver, James Bender, a non-native artist, liked to take full credit for them. And as we've seen, monumental pole carving was not a local art. So the Parks Commission decided to quietly retire these poles and replace them with something more Duwamish. But they forgot to ask the Duwamish themselves. And at a public meeting on the fate of the poles, the local native population came out strongly in their favor. Oliver's assistants and his children recalled seeing his drawings for these poles. And as macaw carver Greg Colfax told the Parks Commission, quote, "When it comes to carving, it is the person who does the drawing, who does the design, that's who owns it." And Colfax went on to say, quote, "The one with a husband and wife, that's a killer. That's top notch. That's Marvin's thinking. That's Marvin's brilliance," end quote. So the poles are currently being conserved, and I understand, I last heard that they should be reinstalled this fall, and Marvin Oliver's sister, Marilyn Bard, will be part of that ceremony. One of my favorite poles in Seattle is this one, which I think is one of the less known. It is it's in East Montlake Park. It's the very northwest corner of the Arboretum. And this is one of those poles carved in Alaska by Chief John Dewey Wallace in the 1930s, in the WPA era of recarving, of making replicas of poles that were falling into disrepair. So this is probably a copy of an earlier Haida pole. But what I love about this pole is that its story, the story of North Island, is also the story of carving in general among the Haida. And it's the tale of an old woman who was at the top, who is no longer a productive member of her society. And so she is, her people are starving. And so she is left on North Island to die. She's abandoned by her community. But an eagle feeds her. So the next figure is an eagle with a salmon in its talons, in its beak. An eagle brings her salmon and other gifts of food. But then a bear starts coming and stealing the gifts before the old woman can take possession of them. And so she prays for deliverance from this bear. And she is given a child. She's far beyond childbearing age, but she's given a miraculous son. And her son learns how to fashion bows and arrows and is able to kill the bear that is taking the gifts of the eagle. And one night, the son and the old woman have a vision that they must keep their eyes closed. Oh, I think I have details of some of these. So there's the eagle with the salmon. There is the bear. Here is the sun. And they have this vision that they must keep their eyes closed all night until sunrise. And at sunrise, when they open their eyes, they see that a mythological being, a humanoid one, has created from their shack a longhouse with 3 carved totems outside. And that was the beginning of totems. That is how Haida carving was initiated. Now, we're not entirely sure how this totem got from the cannery in Alaska, where it was installed in 1937, to Seattle in 1981, except that it was the gift of the Committee of 33, a local philanthropic association. They also paid for it to be restored in 2013. 3 different totem poles have graced Admiral Viewpoint in West Seattle. This is a historic photograph of the original one. And it apparently was carved in 1901. But it was given to the city of Seattle in 1939 by J.E. Stanley of Ye Olde Curiosity Shop. And he said that it was Haida. But if we compare this with actual Haida carving, I think that we can safely say that the North Seattle pole or the West Seattle pole is not Haida. rather that it was the product of the Williams family, those Dididot carvers who adopted their local carving style to carve monumental poles. But by mid-century, oh, and the reason why he gave it to Seattle in 1939 was that was when the Pioneer Square pole had been sent to Alaska for recreation. So Seattle was without its characteristic totem pole. By mid-century, it had suffered significant damage and eventually was deemed decayed beyond repair. So this pole was copied, and the job went to the lowest bidder, Frye. It was copied by volunteers Bob Fleischman and Michael Morgan, Boeing engineers who roughed it out with chainsaws in the family garage, and then finished it with hand tools. It was painted by Morgan and Fleischman and their family members and their neighbors. It was sort of a community project. However, by 2006, it was reportedly weather ravaged and bug infested. So this pole was restored, and as Elizabeth told us, it was erected at the Log House Museum on Alki, just off of Alki. And the Admiral site was graced by a new pole by Michael Halliday, a Duwamish carver. Halliday calls this the first ever Duwamish totem pole or story pole, because traditionally the Duwamish carved many things, but not poles. The Admiral site. So this is, if you get off of the West Seattle Bridge and you take the Admiral exit and you head north towards Admiral, there is a splendid viewpoint. Let me see if it's visible in the photograph. No, if you look somewhat to the right of the way this photograph is angled, there is a fabulous view of the port and the skyline of Seattle across the water from West Seattle. It's one of the most gorgeous views in Seattle. This first Duwamish pole is the third pole to inhabit this site. And Michael Halliday designed it based on Duwamish iconography. So the figure at the top is Thunderbird, which represents the power of Chief Sayald, who is this figure, who is seen above three members of his community. Three Duwamish faces. It was Chief Sayald who presided over the settling of Seattle by the first European colonizers. And here we see the clipper ship that brought them. And then at the very bottom is this figure, which is a traditional Duwamish welcoming figure. And three-dimensional figures were carved in this pose, but Halliday was also looking at Coast Salish spindle whorls. These were functional objects, but highly decorated ones that were used for spinning mountain goat wool. But you can see the similarity in iconography between the spindle whorl at the left and Halliday's iconography. So he used his tribe's history of carving and his tribe's political history to create the iconography of this first ever Duwamish pole. Now, there is another totem pole in West Seattle at the Rotary Club Viewpoint Park, which is a little farther south. And this one was the gift to West Seattle of the Rotary Club. It was carved by Robin Young, who was Native American of the Cheyenne River and South Dakota, Cheyenne River Sioux and South Dakota Mandan. In other words, not a Pacific Northwest coast heritage. And he was teaching carving at Highline Community College at that time. So Young carved this pole. It was erected in 1976, and in 2009, it disappeared. And shortly, Seattle residents were wondering where it had gone. Well, another Seattle resident, a man named Charles Jenks, was building a second home in Black Diamond that had a tall stairwell, and he thought this would look really good there. So he hired a crane truck, told the driver he was from the city of Seattle and taking the pole to be conserved. And they went in and put the chopped it down, put the pole on the crane truck, and then they got it bogged down. It was November. The grass was wet, and the local police aided the malefactors in getting the crane truck out of the muck and on its way. There were a lot of witnesses to this, and the crane truck driver said, well, this is the guy who hired me. Charles Jenks said, oh no, I had nothing to do with it. But the pole was found at one of his properties, in addition to a pole he had stolen from Renton Fred Meyer. And instead of going to jail, Jenks was charged about $21,000 for the restoration and return of this pole, which is now firmly anchored to the ground. Nowadays, it is native and local carvers who are carving most of the poles that are going up in Seattle. Carvers like Rick Williams, who in 2011 decided to carve a pole honoring his brother, John T. Williams. John T. Williams was shot downtown by Seattle police officer Ian Burke, who told him to halt. He was crossing the street. Burke yelled at him to stop. Williams was virtually deaf, and he was holding a carving knife. According to Burke's account, Williams turned to him and raised the knife threateningly. According to the dashboard camera and all the witnesses, that did not occur. Burke shot Williams 5 times, ending his life. So his brother publicly carved this pole, involved the community to see as he was doing it, and publicly involved the community in the raising of this pole at its site in Seattle Center, just south of Mopop. Over 100 people helped to raise the pole. The iconography includes at the top, eagle, as the Williams family. Yes, this family that is descended from the carvers that first came to work for Yield Curiosity Shop. They are of the Eagle clan. At the bottom is Mother Raven, and in between is the figure of John T. Williams himself, and he holds the emblem of kingfisher and salmon. Kingfisher with a salmon face down in his talons. This is a family crest of the Williams family. It is something very personal. But Rick Williams said that that the police officer had taken away something beautiful and that he wanted to give something beautiful back to the city. An even more recent poll graces Northwest Hospital. And it was carved by David Boxley, whose sister-in-law, Cindy James, was undergoing cancer treatment at Northwest Hospital. And every time she passed Northwest Hospital's outdated, probably non-native totem pole, she grimaced. And finally, she said, "You need to get rid of that ugly pole. And I know just the person to carve you a new one, my brother-in-law." So James helped Boxley design the pole and to design the ceremonies, the dances, the songs that would accompany the erection of the pole. But she herself lost her battle with cancer before it could be completed. Cindy James was an accountant, but also a traditional native dancer, someone who was very active in keeping alive Tsimshian native traditions. So she is this figure, which is the low man on the totem pole. We use that cliche to mean the least important member of an organization. But in this poll and many, the bottom figure is the most important figure, the one holding up the rest. Cindy was described as the strong one, the glue of her family. So she's at the bottom with her hands on the shoulders of her grandson, passing on their traditions. The James family is of the Eagle clan. So the eagle appears at the top of the pole, and below it is this shaman figure with bear claw headdress and rattle, who represents the healers, the oncologists, the nurses, the caregivers, all who help the sick and the vulnerable. Below the shaman are representations of those patients. And below that, a bent wood box with on its side the familiar ribbon of cancer awareness, but done in form line, a powerful fusion of the traditional and the contemporary. Totem poles have been in Seattle for 125 years now, and modern native carvers continue to make them, working within traditional styles, but also incorporating modern symbols or adopting Coast Salish motifs to this monumental format. Rather than representing the power of the elite, whether that was a chief commissioning a potlatch memorial or the non-natives who appropriated these objects to decorate their city, these poles' meanings have expanded into the personal and the political. Now they stand not for boosterism, but instead embody the vitality of our area's indigenous populations. Thank you. So I'm going to stop the share and take a look at the Q&A. I think I answered a couple of the questions. No, sadly, she did not beat her cancer. Could anyone from West Seattle say specifically where Rotary Viewpoint is?
It's just sort of east of the junction. You'll see it off of 35th, east of the Alaska Junction.
Okay, so sort of Midwest Seattle. And the point of the frog story was that mother of all women was in her lineage. And oh, yes. So a naturally fallen cedar to use for a canoe. Were there similar rules for trees used for totems? There, each tribe had different rules for trees used for totems. But there would be, if they did fell a tree, there would be a ceremony. The tree would be ritually thanked. And then every part of the tree would be used, the bark, the shavings, everything possible that could be harvested from that tree. More frequently, I know that the pole that the Boeing engineers used, the one that's now at the Log House Museum, that was a downed red cedar from Schmitz Park. I know that the Forest Service provided the one that Michael Halliday used. So it may have been a downed cedar as well. But yes, there was ceremony involved with choosing a tree. Yes, well, Mandan may be in North Dakota, but if I remember properly, whatever it said on the slide, Robin Young, just flipping back through my slides, Robin Young was of the South Dakota branch of the Mandan. Although part of the tribe is in North Dakota.
Rebecca, I wanted to jump in and see if I could help by rewording the questions. Did you answer the question about why was carving criminalized? You
Yes,
mentioned
I
that
did
earlier.
answer that
All
one.
right,
Mhm.
good. And then
And the frog
you get the
lady.
question about the north wind, south wind pole.
No, I do not know anything about that north wind, south wind pole
Outside of
Fire Station in
in
Allentown.
Arlington. Yeah, Allentown.
No, I do not know anything about that pole. It did not crop up in my research.
And then Clay Eels commented on 35th in Alaska, but that must not be to that same question.
The rotary totem. So there are a couple of questions about painting the poles. And it's not actually true that the oldest ones were not painted. Some of them were, and some of them were not. And the traditional pigments were a red ochre and a black that was derived from, from burning, from soot or, charcoal. And that was mixed with salmon eggs that the women of the tribe chewed to get to the proper consistency for paint, and then it was mixed with the minerals for the colors. The Haida, actually, a couple of the tribes had a blue and a green. Those were used very rarely because those were quite rare mineral pigments. The green, I think, was called Vivianite. I can't remember the name of the blue stone that was ground and also mixed with the salmon roe. So some of the early ones were painted, but the brilliant colors arise as well with contact. So In addition to steel tools, modern pigments were something that could be traded with the local tribes. And so you get a larger array of colors with modern paints, although some carvers prefer to stick with the traditional colors. And some carvers, like Michael Halliday, prefer not to paint their poles. So there were different traditions in different places. So does that
I'm not
answer the
sure if you
colors?
read the comments thanking you so much for the presentation. Jackie specifically said she thanked you for your very informative presentation, and your enthusiasm is refreshing. And we find that too. You've shared a lot of details that makes it very, very interesting, more interesting for us.
Thank
Did you
you.
get all the questions? I think you did. Just other thank yous up above.
Oh, it's a new
Fascinating
one.
stories. Yeah, Tony agreed that those are very fascinating stories.
Are there any issues about repatriating poles? And was there any directional facing of the poles? There have been issues about repatriating poles. There is, if you look online, you will find a long and rather crazy story about a pole that originally was stolen by John Barrymore, the Hollywood actor, that ended up in various places, but was eventually repatriated. But yes, the repatriation of poles is something that has been talked about and in some cases has been done. Most museums are not repatriating their poles. And Seattle has chosen, well, I don't know what they did with the original pole. It ended up in Alaska. So maybe the original pole that had been the memorial for Mother of All Women, maybe after it was copied and returned in the 1930s, maybe it did go back to lie in the state at Fort Tongass, where it originally was erected, but I don't know. But the one that we have now was not stolen. It was purchased in the 1930s to replace a stolen pole. So it's not quite as egregious. But yes, there are repatriation issues. And I'm sure there are directional issues as well that a native expert on the poles could tell you about. I am more of a dilettante, and so sadly, I don't have a good answer for that question, but I'm sure that there would have been, that the poles were raised very deliberately and cited very deliberately. And I'm sure that directionality featured into that. Thank you all so much for coming.
More thank yous on your interesting tidbits, all of it. And if there are no other questions, we can close now. But yes, I appreciate all of the questions asked of you, Rebecca, and thank you very much for all the details that you shared and locations and the painting and the, I can't imagine many more questions we would have. So thank you again. It's nice to meet you.
Likewise, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you, audience, for being here. Please tune in next month, second Thursday of the month, and it'll be a very interesting session as well. Good night, everyone.